When Jungkook stepped into the sleek, glass-walled studio of the Honest Table with Han Seo-jin, no one knew the air was about to change. To the audience, it was just another celebrity interview, another polished segment for prime time, another crafted conversation beneath bright studio lights. But for the people in that room and for millions who would later watch what unfolded, it became something far more than just an appearance. It became a reckoning. Han Seo-jin had built her name like a fortress, brick by brick, question by question. Young, unapologetic, and surgically sharp, she had risen through the cutthroat world of Korean television with a smile that could slice and words that left reputations bleeding. Her show, The Honest Table, was a place where power was tested, narratives were spun, and carefully constructed personas often unraveled before the cameras stopped rolling. And tonight, she had her biggest catch yet. Jungkook, the golden voice of a generation, the face of a billion dreams, the enigma who rarely gave interviews and even more rarely lost control. For nearly a decade, the world had watched him grow, perform, and command stages that spanned continents. But beneath the spotlights, behind the velvet walls of fame, he had remained largely unreadable. He was known for his silence. And that silence, Han thought, would be her leverage. The control room buzzed with static energy. Camera operators adjusted their rigs, stagehands whispered final instructions, and producers huddled over live edit monitors, prepped to clip every breath and pause into viral-worthy soundbites. The floor of the studio gleamed, a polished mirror beneath the set's soft white architecture. Every detail was curated down to the cold steel mugs and faux wood paneling that gave the illusion of comfort while encouraging confession. Outside the studio, a crowd of fans had formed hours earlier. Some wore light-up banners. Others held trembling signs with Jimin's name and Jungkook's face drawn with pencil-shaded reverence. But inside, the audience was different. Strategically selected. Media insiders. Opinionated liberals. Cultural critics. The kind of people who didn't swoon. The kind who dissected. Han Seo-jin was dressed for war. She wore a cream silk blouse with a neckline just conservative enough to signal sophistication, paired with minimalist earrings and a calculated smirk. Her fingers tapped against the cue cards in her lap as she rehearsed not the questions, she knew those by heart, but the timing. When to lean forward, when to raise a brow, when to smile like a friend, and when to strike like a serpent. And then he walked in. Jungkook didn't need to announce himself. He didn't need to perform. He moved like quiet gravity, slow, composed, his presence enough to draw every eye in the room without effort. Dressed in a muted black suit, his hair slightly tousled, a single silver earring catching the light, he carried an unbothered grace that only comes with having nothing left to prove. As he took his seat across from Han, the tension in the studio curled like smoke. This wasn't just an interview. This was going to be a moment. The theme music faded. The red light blinked to life. The feed went live across multiple platforms. The network's social media team hovered, ready to post the first clip the moment blood was drawn. Han welcomed him with a smile so soft it felt like the first slice of a knife. Jungkook, thank you for joining us on The Honest Table. You've been difficult to catch. Jungkook gave a quiet nod, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Schedules, he said simply. The audience chuckled. Han leaned in. Ah, yes. Schedules. Or maybe selective appearances? Another laugh. Lighter. Controlled. I go where I feel I should, Jungkook replied, tone unreadable. Han held his gaze a moment longer, then flipped her card. The small mic attached to her collar caught the slight exhale as she readied herself. They spoke of music, of world tours, of sleepless nights and dreams too big for their own bones. But those were appetizers, everyone in the room knew it. Han wasn't here to discuss albums or performances. She was here to peel back something raw. And then it happened. The moment her eyes flicked to his wrist. Bare. Then to the lapel of his suit. There, tucked beneath a thin thread of fabric, rested something small, something metallic, something personal. A pin. Simple. A tiny silver crescent moon. The camera zoomed in. Subtle but practiced. Han's smile changed. Just a twitch. Just enough for the audience to know. That pin you're wearing, she began, feigning curiosity. It's familiar. Jungkook didn't look down. Didn't touch it. It belonged to someone, he said quietly. Oh? Han tilted her head, voice lifting into a register of feigned surprise. Don't tell me it was Jimin's, wasn't it? There it was, the name. Dropped like a match on dry leaves, the audience murmured. Just slightly. The tension broke for a moment, but it was the wrong kind of laugh. Uneasy, uncertain. Jungkook didn't move. Han pressed forward. You know, she said. It's interesting. You've spent years cultivating an image of strength, independence, passion. But then, this. She gestured lightly toward the pin. Still holding on to someone who's no longer relevant? The word hit like a blade. Relevant. There was no change in Jungkook's face. No twitch. No blink. But something in the air shifted. A static quiet. A pulse that went unnoticed until it slowed. Han smiled wider. I mean, he's not even active right now, is he? Some say he's taken a step back. Others say he's been struggling. Emotionally. Professionally. You've always been the shining one. The leader. The face. She leaned forward. So why cling to the past? There was a moment. A long one. The kind that stretches seconds into minutes. And then, Jungkook spoke. His voice didn't rise. Didn't shake. It came low. Controlled. Like the hush before a thunderstorm. You mock what you don't understand. The words weren't loud, but they cracked through the studio like glass under pressure. Han blinked. Just once. Oh, I wasn't mocking, she replied too quickly. Just observing. Jungkook's eyes met hers. Steady. Deep. Quietly furious. No, he said. You were mocking him. And me. Because it's easier to ridicule than to ask what something means. The audience had stopped moving. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Han tried to recover. Come on, Jungkook, we're just talking. No need to get emotional. But he wasn't emotional. Not in the way she meant. He was precise. I wear this, he said, finally lifting his fingers to touch the pin gently. Not because I'm clinging to anyone. Not because I need to prove something. But because it reminds me of the kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to be real. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Dense. Han faltered. Her cards slipped slightly in her lap. She caught them. Adjusted. Jungkook didn't stop. You sit here behind lights and scripts and clips ready to go viral, waiting for a moment you can control. But you forget something. He leaned in just slightly. I don't belong to this table. You do. The breath left the room. Somewhere in the back, a producer dropped his pen. Han tried to laugh, but the sound didn't land. I wasn't trying to attack you. You didn't attack me, Jungkook replied. You tried to humiliate someone who's not even here to defend himself. That's not honesty. That's cowardice. Her mouth opened, closed. He continued. Strength isn't found in tearing others down for applause. It's found in what you hold on to when the crowd turns quiet. Then, with emotion so soft it felt unreal, he unclasped the pin from his jacket and held it between his fingers. This, he said, was given to me when he thought I needed light. Not fame, not attention, just light. It meant nothing to the world, but it meant everything to me. He looked up, straight into the lens. So if you think I'll be ashamed of it, or of him, you're not just wrong, you're lost. The first tear didn't come from Jungkook. It came from someone in the audience. Silent. Unnoticed. But it shimmered in the reflection of the stage lights. Han Seojin said nothing. Because at that moment, there was nothing left to say. The studio had gone still. Not silent still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from absence of sound, but from presence of weight. It sat in the air. Thick and unmoving. Like fog over a frozen lake. Every breath felt loud. Every blink too sudden. Han Seojin's fingers curled slightly around her cue cards. The once crisp edges now creased beneath her grip. The cards hadn't moved, but they suddenly felt heavier, less like tools of control, more like a shield she didn't know how to use. Across from her, Jungkook sat, unchanged. He hadn't shifted in his seat. He hadn't raised his voice. But the equilibrium of the room had tilted. The quiet fury behind his eyes hadn't flared. It had simmered controlled, unwavering, and far more dangerous than anything explosive. The audience didn't know what to do with their expressions. Some were still frozen mid-laugh, their mouths half-curved into awkward remnants of a reaction they now regretted. Others had leaned forward without realizing it, drawn closer by the magnetic gravity of a moment that had transformed from talk show banter into something utterly, irreversibly human. Behind the cameras, the crew was still. A producer motioned for the social team to pause. Not clip. Not yet. The air had changed. The room wasn't trending anymore, it was trembling. Han inhaled. Just a little too sharp. Jungkook, she began, her voice softer, more measured now. I think you may have misunderstood my intent. No, he said before she could continue. I didn't. She blinked. I didn't misunderstand. You just didn't expect to be understood. The words weren't cruel. That's what made them cut deeper. They weren't meant to hurt. They were meant to hold up a mirror. and Han, for all her practiced posture and calculated elegance, suddenly saw herself in its reflection clear, unfiltered, and unprepared. She tried to recover. Well, perhaps we should take a step back. She offered a laugh that was too light, too rehearsed. Let's talk about your new single, your upcoming album. I'm not here to promote a song, Jungkook interrupted gently. I agreed to sit at your table, not to sell something. To speak. His voice held the same melody it always had, but the lyrics were different now. There was something behind them, something unshakable. Han adjusted the collar of her blouse. Then tell me, she said, attempting control once more. Why now? Why speak now when silence has always served you so well? And for the first time, Jungkook paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, because he wanted her to hear it. All my life, he said slowly, people have spoken for me. Fans, media, critics, even friends. Everyone had a version of me they believed. Some loved it, some hated it, but very few ever asked me who I actually was. A long silence. I stayed quiet because I thought that was safer for me, for those I cared about. But lately, he looked up, not at her, but just above the camera, as if addressing something or someone else entirely. I've realized silence can become complicity, and I won't be complicit in letting people be mocked for what they mean to me. Han's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Because that was the thing about Jungkook, he didn't argue. He revealed. And revelation doesn't need volume, it just needs truth. Jimin, he said for the first time aloud, is not just a name, not just a member, not just a memory. The way he said it gently, but firmly made the air ache. He is a part of me I will never apologize for. Somewhere in the crowd, someone swallowed hard. Han could feel the ground shifting again, and this time, she didn't know how to stop it. She attempted to change tone. Her voice dipped into something more casual. You must understand how it looks though, she said, crossing her legs, performing calm. Wearing a symbol of someone who's not active anymore, someone some might say has faded it, sends a message. And when people in your position send messages, they get interpreted. I know, Jungkook nodded. Everything I do gets interpreted, sometimes misinterpreted. But I'd rather be misunderstood for standing by something real than praised for abandoning it. Han opened her mouth, closed it. The studio lights above flickered slightly, not from failure, but from shift, like the atmosphere had changed their voltage. And if this, Jungkook continued, fingers brushing the pin again, makes one person remember that loyalty still matters in this world, then it was worth wearing. Han's throat tightened. She didn't know why. She had sparred with politicians, debated authors, torn through CEOs. But this wasn't a sparring match. It was a confession. And she didn't know how to fight confession. Jungkook looked at her then, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something harder to face, disappointment. I came here to speak. You invited me because you said your show was about honesty. He tilted his head slightly. Was that the truth or just the title? The audience winced. A ripple of tension, not because he had yelled, but because he hadn't. His calm was too loud. Han's voice came back, a little smaller now. I believe in honesty. I do. But I also believe in challenging ideas. That's how growth happens. Then challenge me, Jungkook said. Ask what the pin means. Ask why I wear it. Don't insult someone who's not here to defend themselves and call it growth. There it was again, that mirror. And Han could see herself. A flicker of vulnerability crept across her face, masked quickly by professionalism. But the damage had already been done. For a moment, no one said anything. The studio stood suspended, a heartbeat waiting to drop. Then Jungkook leaned back in his chair, his voice softer than ever. I'm not ashamed of love, he said. Even if it doesn't fit your narrative. Even if it's inconvenient. Even if it's no longer trending. Another silence. A deeper one. Then he whispered, almost to himself, especially then, and the camera caught it. Every syllable, every still breath in the room. The crew didn't know what to do. The director didn't cut, because no one wanted to look away. Jungkook had spoken, and the world was listening. The red lights above the cameras blinked silently, still glowing, still recording. The room hadn't moved in minutes, but it felt as though something enormous had happened. Something tectonic, not with an explosion, but with a slow, irreversible shift. And in the center of it all sat Jungkook, quiet, unmoving, but no longer simply a guest. He had become something else entirely. Across from him, Han Seojin adjusted her posture. It was subtle, just a tightening of the shoulders, a slight shift in her weight, but for someone so controlled, it spoke volumes. She wasn't rattled. Not exactly. She was awakening. awakening to the fact that this moment was no longer hers. That control had slipped not with a scream, not with a clash, but with a sentence. And Jungkook wasn't finished. He looked toward the crowd, not to the host, not to the cameras, but to the people seated just behind the glow of the studio lights. His voice was softer now, not from uncertainty, but because it carried the kind of weight that didn't require projection. Do you know how many times I've been told to move on? A murmur. Maybe a breath. Maybe a reaction. I hear it in interviews. I hear it in the silence of people who used to call, but don't anymore. I hear it every time someone says Jimin like it's a phase I should have grown out of. The name hung in the air like incense, fragile, sacred, and not meant to be rushed. I've been told, he continued, that my loyalty makes me weak, that my past makes me less marketable, that keeping memories alive makes me look broken. He paused. But do you know what really breaks a person? The audience leaned in. Han didn't speak, pretending you've forgotten someone you still love. A beat, 2, 3. Then silence again, stretching long enough for people to hear their own thoughts echo. I've had people, Jungkook said, his voice now threading through every corner of the studio, look me in the eyes and say, "You're too attached. Let it go." As if grief, or loyalty, or love, has an expiration date. He glanced down at the pin again. Not to dramatize, just to remember. This doesn't represent the past. It represents who I became because of him. It's not about clinging, it's about honoring. Han finally found her voice. It was thinner now, like a blade dulled by friction. You do realize, she said, choosing each word carefully, that to some people, this sounds like heartbreak you never move past. Jungkook nodded, without hesitation. Maybe I haven't, and maybe I don't want to. The honesty didn't land like a weakness. It landed like a fist. Unexpected, unapologetic. Han tried again. She was reaching now not for dominance, but for direction. Some would say, she offered, that growth means learning to let go, to evolve beyond attachments. Jungkook smiled, not mockingly, almost sadly. They always say that when it's someone else's love story, he replied. Funny how easy it is to preach detachment when you've never felt something so deep it scared you. The crowd murmured. This time louder. Not judgment. Recognition. Jungkook wasn't performing. He was remembering. And in his remembrance, others remembered too. Han set her cards down now, gently, palms flat on the table. A silent surrender. No one expected you to be this vulnerable, she said softly. Especially not here. Jungkook looked at her then. Really looked. Not with disdain, not with challenge, but with the gaze of someone who had learned to see through words. I didn't come here to be expected, he said. I came here to be honest. She sat back, quiet. Tell me something, he asked suddenly, his voice a little firmer now. Do you think love is weakness? Han blinked. I know I don't. Then why did you frame it like one? There it was, the cut. But not a violent one, a precise one. A question that didn't demand an answer but made it impossible to avoid. Han swallowed, her hands folded in her lap. Jungkook continued. You said Jimin isn't relevant anymore. But you used his name to provoke me. To make a point, to go viral. So let me ask you. He leaned forward, the first time he had moved toward her the entire show. If he's not relevant, why are we still talking about him? Han's lips parted, but no sound came. Jungkook didn't need her reply. The truth is, he said, people like you don't fear irrelevance. You fear meaning. You fear what you can't measure with numbers or noise. And love can't be quantified. He stood then, not out of anger, not out of protest, just because he was done sitting. And when he stood, the room didn't breathe. Because when someone who has stayed silent for years finally speaks, and then rises, you don't respond. You watch. He looked down at her not from above, but from a place of quiet sorrow. I came here thinking this might be a conversation. He gestured to the empty air between them. But I realize now, it was a test. Han blinked. No, and that's okay, he said, because I passed it. But you, a pause. You're still trying to figure out the question. With that, he turned not dramatically, not defiantly, just with peace. He walked off the stage. No music, no commercial, just the sound of his footsteps, soft and certain, disappearing behind the curtain. And Han? She sat still, eyes wide, hands trembling, not because she had been shouted at, not because she had been humiliated, but because someone had looked at her, seen her, and still walked away. and somewhere deep inside her chest, something cracked. For a long moment, no one in the studio moved. The cameras kept rolling, but even the mechanical whir of the equipment seemed hesitant, afraid to disturb whatever sacred rupture had just occurred in the space between silence and consequence. The spotlight that had once served to glorify now illuminated something far less comfortable, the aftermath of truth. Han Seo-jin remained seated at the table, her expression frozen, not in embarrassment but in revelation. Her fingers no longer touched the cue cards. They simply rested on the wood-grain surface, still and unsure, as if unsure what they were supposed to do now. Behind her eyes, thoughts scrambled, desperate to rewrite the moment, to rearrange events, to reframe her words into something less cruel, less obvious, less exposed. But the air in the studio had become immune to spin. She looked out toward the audience. Gone were the nods, the polite smiles, the subtle smirks that usually accompanied her sharpest lines. In their place sat stillness, and worse, eyes that were no longer entertained, but quietly questioning. A part of her, some long-buried instinct, wanted to stand, to chase after him, to call him back and say, "Wait, I didn't mean it like that." But she didn't move, because some things you don't chase. Not when you've broken them. Not when they leave out of respect for themselves, not rage. She exhaled, a quiet cracking sound barely caught by her lapel mic. Then the studio director's voice echoed faintly through the earpiece in her right ear. "Cut?" She didn't answer. Another voice whispered through the intercom. "Ma'am, should we go to break?" Still, she said nothing. Instead, her gaze drifted back to the seat across from her, empty now, but still holding the shape of him. Jeon Jungkook. He hadn't stormed out. He hadn't snapped. But he had done something far more dangerous to her brand. He had spoken with integrity, and it had dismantled her performance like glass under heat. The producers behind the glass wall were already scrambling. A chorus of voices overlapping, debating edits, timestamps, damage control, possible statements. One of them muttered, "Maybe we clip around it. Cut the Jimin part. Make it about the album." Another replied, "You can't cut around the truth." It wasn't loud, but it was honest. Han heard it, and it landed harder than any insult. Because now the truth wasn't just Jungkook's. It belonged to the room, to the audience, to the world beyond the cameras, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath the polished image, beneath the curated liberal persona, beneath the years of calculated dominance, Han Seo-jin felt something rise. Guilt. Not shame. Not yet. But guilt, the beginning of it, the kind that doesn't announce itself with tears or confessions, but creeps in through the cracks of silence. Uninvited but unrelenting. She stood. Slowly. Her chair made a small sound as it scraped the floor. Nothing dramatic. Just real. And then, without prompting, without script, without direction from the crew, she did something no one expected. She walked off set. The crew turned to each other in confusion. The audience murmured. But no one stopped her. Because everyone in that room, even those who had never liked Jungkook, even those who had rolled their eyes at mentions of Jimin, had felt it. The moment had become sacred, and no one wanted to be the one to cheapen it. Backstage, Han moved past the curtains, past the crew, past the chaos of post-broadcast strategy. She didn't go to the dressing room. She went down the hall, around the corner, to the side entrance where a black car was already pulling away. Too late. She stepped out into the evening air anyway. The city hummed beyond the lot, normal, unbothered. But her chest wasn't. She looked down. Her hands were trembling. She hated that. She was always composed. Always. But Jungkook hadn't shouted. He hadn't broken her down. He had reminded her of what she once believed in, before the ratings, before the applause, before the headlines. And she didn't know what to do with that. The driver of the black car glanced in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am?" She waved him off. "I'm not getting in." He nodded once, uncertain, then drove off. She stood there alone, beneath the amber glow of a security lamp, with nothing but her thoughts and the faint memory of his final words echoing in her chest. "I didn't come here to be expected. I came here to be honest." The headlines arrived before the night had even finished. Clips from the interview, uncut, raw, and filled with the kind of silence that spoke louder than any outburst, began flooding the internet like an incoming tide. Jungkook walks off live set after defending Jimin, audience stunned. Love isn't weakness. Jungkook delivers quiet masterclass in loyalty. Han Seo-jin faces backlash after mocking BTS member, internet reacts. Jungkook's silence speaks volumes and Korea is listening. The hashtags trended globally within hours. Number protect Jimin. Number respect Jungkook. Number the honest collapse. Number Jungkook speaks. And buried somewhere beneath those, smaller but growing, number Han Seo-jin apologize. It had become what no studio, no PR team, no executive producer could ever manufacture, a cultural moment. The kind that couldn't be edited, couldn't be reframed. The kind that didn't ask permission to exist, it simply did. And at the center of it all stood two names, Jungkook, and the one she had dared to mock, Jimin. Han Seo-jin sat alone in the studio's private conference room, her perfectly curated blouse now creased from the weight of a posture she couldn't hold anymore. The walls around her, once filled with awards, magazine covers, and praise for her fearless truth-seeking journalism, now felt claustrophobic. Her phone buzzed endlessly, her inbox filled with both fire and frost. Some praised her bravery. Others condemned her cruelty. But the worst messages weren't the insults. They were the mirrors. Comments that simply said, "You crossed a line. That wasn't journalism. That was bullying." Plain and simple. And the one that hit deepest, "You knew he couldn't defend himself, so you picked on someone who wasn't in the room." She read that one 5 times. Because it wasn't about Jungkook. It was about Jimin. Meanwhile, Jungkook sat in the back of a silent van, his head resting lightly against the cool window as the lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of white and amber. He hadn't spoken since he left the studio. Not to the crew, not to his manager, not even to himself. He didn't need to. The truth had already been said. But even now, even after all of it, his chest ached. Not with regret. He didn't regret standing up for Jimin. Not for a second. The ache came from something else. From memory. He remembered the first time Jimin gave him that crescent moon pin. They had been in Tokyo, walking back to the hotel after a sleepless rehearsal. The city was buzzing with neon and quiet steam rising from the street grates. Jungkook had been unusually quiet that night. Jimin noticed. He always noticed. Without saying much, Jimin reached into his bag and pulled out a tiny gift box. "I saw this," he had said softly, "and I thought of you." Inside, the silver moon. Simple. Small. Imperfect. "I know you don't wear much," Jimin had added, "but this felt like you." Jungkook had smiled, but it was the kind of smile that came from somewhere too full to explain. And now, years later, after all the chaos, after the distance, after the silences that had grown between them like vines, he still wore it. Not out of habit, out of principle. Because some people don't fade. They just live differently in your life. In a small corner of the city, Jimin was watching. He hadn't meant to. He had told himself he wouldn't. That he didn't care. That interviews like that meant nothing. But curiosity is a loud thing in the quiet hours. And when the first clip surfaced online, he clicked. He told himself he'd only watch a minute. He stayed for 20. He saw everything. The smile Han wore. The way she said his name like it was disposable. The way Jungkook didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't let it pass. He saw the pin. Still there. Still worn. Still his. And when Jungkook said those words, "I'm not ashamed of love," especially then, Jimin pressed pause. Because his heart had just forgotten how to breathe. Back in the studio building, long past midnight, Han Seo-jin walked quietly down the hallway. Her heels clicked a little too loudly against the marble, like guilt disguised as confidence. The production team had gone home. Only a few security guards remained, eyes polite, questions silent. She reached the green room Jungkook had used before the show. It was empty now. Of course it was. But she stepped inside anyway. The air still held traces of his cologne, clean, subtle, expensive. The bottled water on the table was half drunk. There was a folded napkin near the armrest, a small black pen beside it. No signature. No note. But she stared at it for a long time, as if maybe the wood grain held some secret answer to who he was and why his words had hit her so deeply. And then, for the first time in years, Han Seo-jin whispered into an empty room, "I was wrong." Not because she was caught, not because she was trending for the wrong reasons, but because something inside her had cracked. Not a PR problem, a personal one. And maybe it was time she did something she had never done before. Apologize. Morning broke over Seoul with a kind of quiet that felt undeserved. The city still moved, trains still rumbled beneath the streets, and screens still lit up with the day's headlines, but something felt different. Conversations changed. In cafes, on the subway, in the glowing comment threads across thousands of screens, people weren't talking about Jungkook's comeback or his streaming numbers. They were talking about conviction, about what it means to protect someone's name when they aren't there to hear it. And above all, they were talking about the moment a global idol walked away from a show built to tear him down and did so without a single insult. That kind of strength, it stayed with people. Jungkook hadn't slept. He had tried. He had returned to his quiet apartment, turned off all his notifications, and set his phone on the counter face down. But peace doesn't come easy after you speak your truth. Because even when the world applauds, there's a strange ache that lingers. Not regret, not worry. Just vulnerability. It's one thing to be adored for what you create. It's another to be seen for who you are. He stood on the balcony as the morning light began to spill over the edge of the skyline. The pin still lay on his nightstand unclasped, but close. He hadn't removed it out of shame, only to sleep. And yet he hadn't slept. Jimin was still awake too. The sun hadn't even reached his window yet, but he hadn't closed his eyes. He had watched the clip again, and again, and again. Not because he didn't believe it, but because a part of him still needed to be reminded that someone had defended him openly, publicly, without fear or conditions. He kept hearing the words. Some people don't fade. They just live differently in your life. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a performance. It was just truth. And Jimin hadn't been ready for it, because the silence between them had been long, too long, and filled with so many misunderstandings, missed calls, and headlines that were never meant for healing. He had told himself that Jungkook had moved on, that maybe it was easier that way. But now, he wasn't sure what to feel. All he knew was that something had cracked open again. Not painfully, just gently, like hope. Back at the network headquarters, meetings were being called before dawn. Legal teams, PR strategists, segment editors. Damage control wasn't just urgent, it was already late. Screens filled with comments. Charts tracked the spike in online mentions, and in the center of it all, a single repeated phrase. She needs to apologize. At first, it had been a demand from fans. Then it became a suggestion from critics. Now, it was an expectation from the network itself. But Han Sojin hadn't spoken publicly. Not yet. She was sitting alone in her apartment, a place once filled with awards and glowing headlines, now dimmed by the weight of reflection. She replayed the moment, over and over. You didn't attack me. You tried to humiliate someone who's not even here to defend himself. The words weren't sharp. That's what made them linger. They were simply true. For a woman who built her career on exposing the flaws of others, being exposed by someone who didn't even try to fight back, that left a scar. And scars, when real, don't need to bleed to be remembered. She looked down at her phone, messages from her manager, from the network, from her co-hosts, but she ignored them, because there was one message she needed to send, one that couldn't go through the publicist, or the lawyers. She opened her contacts, searched for the name. She had never messaged him before, but somehow, his number had always been there. Maybe out of courtesy, maybe out of fate. She typed, Jungkook, I want to say I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that's meant to clean up a headline, but the kind that comes from knowing I was wrong. I mocked someone who wasn't even present, and in doing so, I not only disrespected him, I disrespected what he means to you. I understand if you don't respond. I just needed you to know. Han Seo-jin. She hit send. Then she waited. Not for forgiveness, just for the discomfort of accountability to settle. Jungkook didn't reply. Not right away. He read the message. Let it sit. Let it breathe. And then, instead of typing, he opened his camera roll, scrolled, paused on a photo. It was old, a blurry candid. Him and Jimin backstage, both laughing, both unaware they were being photographed. Neither perfectly styled, neither posing. Just real. He sent it. No caption. No emojis. Just the photo. And somehow that said everything. Back at her apartment, Han stared at the image. And she wept. Not from guilt, but from understanding. Because in that moment she knew. She hadn't just mocked a person. She had mocked something sacred. And some things, once you see them clearly, you kneel before them. Not for pity, but out of respect. The photo continued to ripple across the depths of her phone screen. Unfiltered. Blurry. Candid. And yet, it held more clarity than any award-winning documentary she had ever produced. Han Seo-jin sat on the floor of her apartment, knees drawn loosely to her chest, phone resting beside her like a confession laid bare. She couldn't stop staring at it. There was something holy in that moment between Jungkook and Jimin. Something too soft for television, too intimate for interviews, too precious for viral clips. It was not performative. It was love. Not romanticized. Not branded. Not dissected. Just love, quiet, unguarded, and breathtakingly real. And she had tried to reduce it, had called it outdated, had treated it like a throwaway detail. Worse, she had weaponized it, a truth so pure, turned into a punchline. Now that she had seen it for what it truly was, the weight of her mistake did not feel like a scandal. It felt like sin. She folded her hands in front of her face. Not to pray. Not yet. But to hide from her own reflection. Elsewhere in the city, Jimin stood at the corner of a quiet cafe, hidden beneath a cap and mask. It wasn't the kind of cafe that needed a disguise, but anonymity had become his second skin. He hadn't ordered anything. He wasn't hungry. His fingers rested on his phone, unread messages blinking, friends checking in, none of it registered. What stayed with him was the sound of Jungkook's voice. I'm not ashamed of love, especially then. He closed his eyes. Let the memory carry him not to the night of the interview, but far earlier, back when everything was still safe, still theirs. There had been a rooftop, a birthday, a song that was never released. Jungkook had sat beside him, humming something under his breath while strumming an acoustic guitar with chipped polish. Jimin had leaned back, looking at the stars, and Jungkook had said, "If this all ends someday, I just hope we still talk." Jimin hadn't answered back then. He didn't know how to. And in time, they had stopped talking. Not because they fought. Not because they didn't care. But because life got loud. And hearts, when left in silence too long, become strangers to one another. But now, Jungkook had spoken. Loud enough for the world to hear. And louder still, for Jimin to remember. The network had no choice. After 2 days of mounting backlash, of media outlets dissecting the moment frame by frame, of fans demanding justice not for a scandal but for sincerity, the executives gathered in a glass boardroom to make a decision. Han Seo-jin sat at the end of the table. No makeup, no posture, no smile. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to agree. And when they asked her what statement she wanted to release, she said something that caught them all off guard. "I don't want to release a statement," she said. The room quieted. "I want to deliver it in person." 3 days later, the network announced a special broadcast. No trailer, no promo, no clips, just a single message on screen. The Honest Table, one last conversation. It wasn't a season finale. It wasn't a rerun. It was something else entirely. And as the broadcast time approached, the world watched. The lights in the studio were dimmer this time. Softer. No dramatic openings, no applause. Just Han Seo-jin sitting at the same table but in a different posture. No cards. No questions. No smile. Just her. And next to her, an empty chair. She turned to the camera. And then, she bowed. Deep. Long. Unmistakable. "I don't deserve to sit here today," she said quietly, her voice trembling in a way no mic check could fix. "But I asked for this moment not to explain myself but to apologize." She raised her head slowly. "I mocked someone I didn't know. Someone who wasn't in the room to respond. I tried to turn something sacred into something small. And I realize now, that was never my right." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice broke. "To Jimin, if you're watching this, I am sorry. Not because of public pressure, not because I got caught, but because you were loved and I treated that love like a prop." She turned slightly, addressing the empty chair beside her. "And to Jungkook, you defended someone with more dignity than I showed in an entire career. You walked away when I would have stayed to argue. And your silence, your choice to rise without striking back. That's what changed me." She placed her palms flat on the table. "I mocked you for remembering someone. But now, I will remember this. Forever." The screen slowly faded to black. No outro. No credits. No applause. Just a whisper. Some moments should never be interrupted. It was the most unorthodox broadcast in the network's history. No ratings meter could capture what had happened. No social media manager could control the narrative. Because this time there was no narrative. Only truth. And truth doesn't ask for likes. It simply demands to be felt. Within minutes of the final frame fading to black, messages began pouring in from around the world. I cried, "This is what accountability looks like. Jimin deserves better. Jungkook deserves respect." She didn't justify, she just apologized. And that's rare. Let this moment live. Don't spin it, don't meme it, just let it be. People didn't watch it like they watched television. They watched it like they witnessed something personal, like they had been part of the rupture, and now, part of the healing. At that very moment, Jungkook sat alone on the edge of his bed, the glow from the television still reflecting off the opposite wall. He hadn't blinked for nearly 2 minutes. Not because he was stunned, but because something in him had softened. Not melted, not broken, just softened. The words had found him. The apology wasn't flawless. It wasn't poetic, but it was honest. and that made it echo deeper than all the noise. He didn't know what he expected. Certainly not this. But in the quiet after the broadcast, he finally let his shoulders fall. The breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for days. Released. Jimin was watching too. He sat cross-legged on his living room floor, a pillow hugged to his chest, as if bracing himself for another wound. But no wound came. Just a strange, almost surreal feeling of dignity being returned. Like someone had reached into the past and retrieved something they had once stolen. The way Han Seo-jin said his name, this time, it didn't feel like an insult. It felt like recognition. He placed his phone down beside him, unopened, unused. He didn't text Jungkook, not yet, because right now words weren't needed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of something warm, something hopeful. Han Seo-jin didn't return to broadcasting after that. The network wanted her to. The ratings from the apology special had skyrocketed, but she declined every offer. Not out of shame, but because she knew that moment wasn't meant to be capitalized. It was meant to be remembered, and she wanted to remember it with the respect it deserved. Instead, she started something quieter. A small online series, unproduced, unfiltered. She interviewed survivors, healers, poets, teachers, ordinary people with extraordinary truths. No gotcha questions, no viral stings, just listening. And she titled it simply, Unlearned, because that's what she had to do. Unlearn the habit of cutting for sport. Unlearn the instinct to mock the unfamiliar. Unlearn the belief that being heard mattered more than hearing. 3 weeks after the broadcast, a quiet message arrived in her inbox. No subject line, no fancy formatting, just 2 sentences. Thank you for saying my name correctly. I hope you never forget what it cost. Jimin. She stared at it for a long time, not because it was bitter, but because it was merciful. And sometimes, mercy feels heavier than hate. Jungkook hadn't worn the pin in public since the interview. Not because he was hiding, but because now, he didn't need to prove anything. Its meaning was no longer a mystery. The world had seen it, and more importantly understood it. One evening, while walking alone along the Han River, he reached into his pocket and held the pin again. The edges still cool, still imperfect, still Jimin. He didn't clip it on. He just held it. Let it rest in his palm. Let it speak to him in the way only old symbols can. Symbols that outlive shame, outlive ridicule, outlive even the people who once doubted their worth. And in that stillness, with the river glittering quietly below, he smiled. Not because he had won, but because he had stayed true, and that was enough. There are moments in life that don't echo loudly. They don't arrive with fireworks or headlines. They slip into your life like a soft rain after a long drought, quiet, cleansing, and necessary. Jungkook was beginning to live in that kind of moment. It had been a month since the broadcast, a month since the apology, a month since the world stopped talking about Jimin and started remembering who he was. The noise had faded, but the meaning remained. He stood backstage now, not in a studio, not in front of critics, but behind a curtain that led to a small auditorium. The venue wasn't large. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even part of a world tour. Just a quiet night, a small crowd, and a single acoustic guitar resting beside him on a stool. The organizer had called it an evening of stories. Jungkook hadn't planned to speak. He was just supposed to perform one song. But as he stood there, watching the flickering lights through the curtains, something inside him stirred. Not nerves. Conviction. Not the loud kind. The sacred kind. When he stepped out onto the stage, the room hushed almost immediately. There was no roar of fans. No flashing lights. Just faces curious, calm, waiting. He sat down. His fingers brushed the strings of the guitar, but he didn't strum. Not yet. Instead, he leaned into the mic and said, I want to tell you a story. The audience leaned forward. It's not dramatic, it's not glamorous, but it's true, and sometimes that's more powerful. He looked down for a moment, collected himself. There was a time, he began, when I thought silence was strength. That if I kept quiet, no one could twist my words. No one could hurt what I loved. A pause. But silence can become a cage, especially when someone you care about is being misunderstood or erased. Another breath. I was on a show recently. You may have seen it, maybe not. A few people nodded. A few looked away. That night, someone I loved deeply was mocked. No gasps. Just gravity. I had a choice. I could smile and move on, or I could say what I felt. He looked up, his eyes steady, and I chose the second one, not because I wanted to go viral, but because I couldn't stay silent anymore. He gently touched the crescent moon pin now clipped back to his guitar strap. He gave me this years ago. Not because it was trendy, not because he wanted me to wear it publicly, but because he thought I needed something to remind me of light. The room seemed to breathe with him, and for a long time I kept that light private. I was afraid the world would laugh, or worse, turn it into something ugly. He strummed once. A soft, clear note. But love, he whispered, isn't something you hide. He paused, then added with the faintest smile, especially not his. In another part of the city, Jimin stood frozen in the middle of a sidewalk. He hadn't meant to stop, but a stranger had handed him earbuds. I think you should hear this, the girl had said, not recognizing him behind his mask and cap. It's Jungkook's live set from tonight. She had no idea who she was speaking to, and that made it feel even more faded. He took the earbuds, pressed play, and stood there among rushing strangers, glowing storefronts, and the chill of dusk as the voice he knew better than his own reached into him like a fire lit in the ribs. But love isn't something you hide. Especially not his. The words hit different when you weren't ready. And Jimin wasn't ready. Not for how much he'd missed that voice. Not for how much he'd needed to be named again out loud, in love, in light. He pulled the earbuds out, closed his eyes, and breathed. For the first time in what felt like years. After the set, Jungkook walked off stage. No cheers. No cameras. Just a silence that felt like approval, like understanding, like peace. As he stepped outside, the sky was beginning to change indigo, melting into black, stars blinking their quiet affirmations. And then, a figure stepped out from the alley. Hood up, shoulders hunched, hands trembling slightly. Jungkook froze. The air between them thickened, then parted, and there he was. Jimin. No mask, no cap, just eyes. Wide, wet, unafraid. They stared at each other for a long time. No music, no quotes, no audience, just them. Then, Jimin stepped forward. Slow, careful, as if approaching something sacred. And in a voice that cracked not from weakness, but from everything held back too long, he said, You remembered. Jungkook's lips parted, and with the gentlest nod, I never forgot. There are certain moments that live beyond time. They aren't marked by dates, broadcasts, or headlines. They exist quietly, tucked in the folds of breath and memory. And when Jungkook and Jimin stood across from each other under the night sky, the city humming in soft forgetfulness around them, it became one of those moments. No scripts, no applause, no angles, just recognition. Jungkook took a step forward. He didn't rush. He didn't reach out. He waited, because some things, especially the sacred, should never be rushed. Jimin lowered his gaze for a moment. Then, as if pulled by gravity only the heart understands, he closed the distance between them and stood close enough to feel the familiar rhythm of Jungkook's breath. So many words had lived in silence between them. Now, none of them mattered. Only presence did. Jimin looked up. You didn't owe me that, he said softly. Jungkook tilted his head slightly. I didn't do it because I owed you. I did it because it was right. The sincerity in his voice didn't waver. And because I still carry you, Jungkook added, his hand briefly touching the pin on his strap. Even now, Jimin's throat tightened. Not from sadness, from relief. Like something that had been locked inside him had finally been named. He blinked, but the tears didn't fall. Not yet. You didn't have to defend me, Jimin whispered. I know, Jungkook replied, but silence felt like betrayal. They sat on a nearby bench, side by side, saying little. And in that silence, 1,000 things were said. Forgiveness, grief, gratitude, hope, all woven into the space between their shoulders. It was not reconciliation through grand gestures. It was just presence. Shared, accepted, remembered. Hours passed. The streets emptied. The stars rearranged themselves above them like quiet witnesses. And eventually Jimin spoke again. Do you think people will forget this? Jungkook didn't answer immediately. Then he said, maybe. People forget headlines. A pause. But not truth. Not when it's lived. Jimin nodded. Then, after a beat, I never stopped missing you. Jungkook turned his head. And for the first time in years, he allowed the words that had been sitting just behind his ribs to rise. Then let's not go silent again. Jimin exhaled, a breath that sounded like surrender and beginning all at once. Okay, he said. Okay, Jungkook echoed. Somewhere far away, Han Seo-jin watched the stars from her window. No cameras, no makeup, no mic, just her and the night. And as she thought of the boy she had mocked and the man who had defended him, she smiled not because she was proud, but because she had learned. And some lessons are more beautiful than success. She didn't try to call them, didn't try to insert herself again. She just wished them well, because they had found their way back to each other. And that was enough. Weeks passed. The world moved on. The hashtags stopped trending. The articles stopped churning. The algorithms found other stories. But for those who had really watched, something had changed. Not loudly, but deeply. Months later, during a quiet acoustic concert in Busan, Jungkook walked on stage with only one song unannounced. He introduced it without fanfare. No backstory. No grand explanation. Just one sentence. "This is for the ones we never stop carrying." He looked toward the wings of the stage, and there just barely visible stood Jimin, smiling, waiting. And as Jungkook began to sing, a hush fell over the crowd. Because they knew, even if they hadn't been there at the beginning, even if they'd missed the storm, they knew they were witnessing something whole, something healed, something real. And far above it all, somewhere in the stars, the story was written down. Not in ink, not in film, but in memory. Forever. The days after the reunion blurred together like paint on wet canvas. They didn't call it reconciliation. They didn't make a post about it. They didn't offer explanations. They simply began. Again. Quietly. Jungkook and Jimin didn't try to reclaim lost time. Because time, once passed, doesn't get reclaimed. It gets rewritten. The world had calmed. The headlines that once burned across screens like wildfire had cooled into quiet mentions and respectful nods. No one chased them anymore. Not the press. Not the pressure. For the first time in a long time, they were allowed to be not performers, not members, not symbols, just two people walking back into each other's lives. It was raining the night Jimin knocked on Jungkook's door. Not heavy, just soft, steady, like memory falling from the sky. Jungkook opened the door before he even knocked a second time. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He stepped aside. Jimin stepped in, and together, they shared a silence that tasted like peace. Later that night, Jimin placed a small envelope on the kitchen table. Aged, worn, slightly bent at the corners. He didn't speak, just nodded toward it. Jungkook looked at him, then opened it. Inside was a single letter. Unsent, unopened, unspoken, until now. He began to read. Jungkook, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. Maybe I'll be too afraid to send it. Maybe by the time I gather the courage, too much will have changed. But I wanted you to know. I still wear the hoodie you left in my studio. It doesn't fit the way it used to. But I wear it on days I miss your voice the most. Some days I tell myself that maybe I was too hard to love. That maybe I gave too much, too quietly. That maybe you forgot me in all the noise. But even then, I never stopped hoping you hadn't. If you still carry the moon I gave you, then I guess I wasn't just dreaming. Jimin. Jungkook folded the letter carefully, like something sacred, then looked up at Jimin, and in a voice barely above a whisper, You thought I forgot you? Jimin shrugged, almost smiling, but his eyes betrayed him. I wasn't sure anymore. Jungkook took a step closer. I remembered everything. Another step, even the hoodie. Another, and especially, he placed his hand over his chest where the crescent moonpin still rested. This. Jimin swallowed hard. Tears gathered at the edge of his eyes, but he didn't look away this time. Then why didn't you say anything? Jungkook's voice cracked just slightly. Because I didn't think I deserved to. The confession hung in the air like thunder before the rain. Jimin closed the distance. And for the first time in too long, he reached for Jungkook's hand. Fingers trembling, gripping gently, then firmly. I think we both paid enough for silence, Jimin whispered. And Jungkook, he didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just pulled Jimin in, held him, breathed him. And for the first time since everything, they let go. Not of each other, but of the pain, the guilt, the waiting. They let go. And finally, they began again.